Okay. So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على نبينا رسولنا وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So, this is our last session of the Iqbal poetry, and I just want to go through all the sessions that have been discussed. There are some new faces here as well, mashallah. So in the first session, basically Allama Iqbal is a very, very important thinker, philosopher, politician and poet who lived in the first part of the 20th century, and he was from the subcontinent, and he has an extremely wide-ranging and relevant message, and each week I tried to cover a different aspect of Allama Iqbal. In the first session I discussed Iqbal and his idea of khudi, which is his idea of having a deep sense of self-respect and self-dignity that every Muslim and every Muslim group needs to have. In the second session, we discussed Allama Iqbal's famous poem Shikwa, where he personifies the situation of the early 20th century Muslim in the full, like facing the full scourge of Western imperialism and colonialism. And then he replies with the voice of God, giving advice and admonition and telling Muslims what they need to do to rebuild themselves. In the third session, we looked at another one of his poems called Masjid-e-Qurtuba, wherein Iqbal discusses the central role of ishq or love in his poetry and in what he thinks a balanced Islam should have. In the fourth session, there was a discussion of Iqbal's poem addressed to the youth of Islam, which had a really strong decolonial element to it. In the fifth session, mashallah, we discussed Iqbal's use of cosmic imagery in his poetry, and how he uses the imagery of the stars and the galaxies, ultimately, in my opinion, as an invitation for the reader to go deep within themselves. In session 6, we discussed Iqbal's threefold critique of the Muslim world, which is a political and an intellectual and a spiritual critique, attacking political stagnation, intellectual shallowness, and spiritual passivity. In session 7, we discussed how Iqbal understood the relationship between heart and mind, reason and revelation. So it's been quite a journey, and all of these videos, all of these sessions rather, are recorded and they're on YouTube, except for the first one. So if any of these topics interest you, please don't hesitate to go ahead and look them up on YouTube under my name. In this last session, we're going to talk about, in many ways, the biggest and most important, perhaps, theme in Iqbal's thought and poetry. And it's something so visionary, something so path-breaking, and also something so obvious in retrospect when we talk about it. But first, I'll tell a story, an extended analogy. So, there's a street with 7 houses. The owner of each house is related. They're all siblings and cousins. They have their differences. One is shorter, one is longer, one is louder, one is quieter. One thinks he has the best cooking, the other thinks her lawn is the best. One speaks with a different accent, the other writes differently. On the whole, they have more in common than they have in difference. They live similarly, they share the same routines, they have the same worries. One day, a dangerous stranger arrives at one of the houses. He barges in, puts a gun to the head of the household, and forces all of them into subservience. They are to live in the basement now. This is his house from now on. Our protagonist, the former owner of the house, is stunned. How could this happen? Surely the others will send aid. He prays and he prays. Nothing. After much abuse and humiliation, our wretched protagonist sneaks out and pleads for help from his neighbors, from his siblings. You have to help me, he says. I am debased and humiliated and dishonored and oppressed and ruined. Do I not deserve dignity? Silence. Eyes dart, feet shuffle. Sheepishly, the first sibling says, "We are all so concerned for your tragedy. But you see, what does it have to do with us? Our protagonist replies, aren't we bound by common blood and common belief? The second sibling retorts, yes, but you see, you live over there, and we live over here. Does that make a difference? Our protagonist pleads desperately. The third sibling enjoins, you see, it's just that we have so many of our own problems to deal with. Things are so difficult already. We need to worry about the members of our own house first. How can we have time to worry about affairs on that side of the road? The fourth sibling contributes. And besides, I've been reading this new book. It says that rather than worry about everyone's issues, it's better to focus on your own home. And you know, I'm so proud of my home. I've been thinking about touching it up and making it look extra different. A new fence, a fresh coat of paint maybe. But these houses weren't even here a little while ago. We all used to live together, the protagonist protests. The fifth sibling jumps in. Look, the houses are a symbol. It's obvious, are a symbol. It obviously makes much more sense to arrange ourselves based on how we look and how we speak and what type of soil each house has. I mean, haven't you been reading these new books from the next valley? That's what they say. The sixth sibling snorts and says, anyway, we've been thinking, what have you ever done for us anyway? I've been talking to the new owner of the house, and he says we can all cut a deal. And that we'll get those goods that we want for cheaper. I mean, sounds good to us, right? Does this story remind you of anything? This is an analogy for the Muslim Ummah in 2023. What's the worth of a family, of a community, of an Ummah when it becomes trapped in artificial differences and loses sight of the big picture and its members aren't able to help each other out? The topic for tonight, of course, is Iqbal and Muslim unity. One of Iqbal's titles is Hakimul Ummah, Sage of the Ummah, because his thought, his concern, his agenda is not just confined to one area, one space, one people, one group, but the Ummah as a whole. And there's a word that's recently been invented in English by some serious Muslim academics, and it's called ummatic, related to the Ummah. Iqbal was an ummatic thinker, and he went against the tide of his time. Now, Iqbal wasn't always a nomadic thinker. In fact, at the beginning of his intellectual and spiritual journey, he was an ordinary Indian nationalist. By the way, who can tell me what nationalism means?
You go ahead. Okay. Placing the importance of your country, land, or tribe as the most important thing to yourself, your identity, and your, I guess, reason of being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Yes?
I think it's to believe that you are superior because of where you're from.
Okay. Mm-hmm. That's another take on it. Yes. Nationalism is centering your political identity and your sense of who belongs and who doesn't based on an idea of a nation or a country, however it's defined. That's nationalism, basically. And Iqbal was dedicated early in his career to realizing the independence and flourishing of a state in the Indian subcontinent on secular principles. One of his most famous poems, which is still celebrated in India today, recited in schools, is as follows, the first one on our sheet. He says, सारे जहान से अच्छा हिंदुस्तान हमारा, हम बुलबुल हैं इसकी, ये गुलिस्तान हमारा. गुर्बत में हूँ अगर हम, रहता है दिल वतन में, समझो वहीं हमें भी, दिल हो जहां हमारा. मजहब नहीं सिखाता आपस में बैर रखना, हिंदी है हम, वतन है हिंदुस्तान हमारा. The best land in the world is our India. We are its nightingales. This is our garden. If we are in exile, our heart resides in our homeland. understand that we are where our heart is. Religion doesn't teach us to be enemies with each other. We are Indians, and our homeland is our India. Beautiful, powerful. You can see he's a great poet, right? Very, very motivating. Aviral, did you recite this poem in school when you were growing up? Did you ever come across it? Yeah. Yeah. In like assembly or just taught in class? Assembly. Nice.
Wow. Did you believe it when you were saying it?
I mean, it's
It's a loaded question.
It's not. If you're anyway, let's leave the question to the side. I just wanted to see if it's still used. So this is like, a couple of years ago. The poem was written in the early 1900s. So this idea of Indian nationalism is actually a very modern idea. Before British colonialism, people in the subcontinent didn't really think of themselves, didn't really think of India or think of themselves as India in like a political sense. So it has a lot to do with Western ideas being appropriated by like a westernized elite class in the subcontinent and then Indian nationalism. So Iqbal is like a full participant in this. But something happens. Iqbal goes to Europe. His thought transforms. Now we've discussed Iqbal's critiques of Western civilization and philosophy at length in previous sessions. He goes from someone focused on the problems of India to someone focused on the problems of the Muslim world. So instead of him seeing himself as like an Indian first, he starts seeing himself as a Muslim first. And like I just said, the background to that is a deep study and critique of like Western civilization and Western philosophy. He has a change in his consciousness. He's still proud of his language and culture, but he chooses to rise above a narrow view. Remember, change always starts, of course, in the heart. So, for example, he says, "Ajmi kham hai to kya? Main to Hijazi hai meri. Nagma Hindi hai to kya? Le to Hijazi hai meri." So, what if the goblet is Ajami or Persian or non-Arab? Its wine is Hijazi. So, what if the song is Hindi or Indian? Its melody is Hijazi. So here Iqbal is saying Muslims all have their external differences in culture and language, and that's beautiful. The most important thing is the spirit that drives each Muslim. Iqbal's political vision also transforms. He becomes a pan-Islamist. He starts writing in Persian, which enables him to reach a broader audience. In fact, 70% of Iqbal's poetry is in Persian. He raises money for wounded Ottoman soldiers in the Balkan War, for example. The fallen Muslim civilization of Spain occupies a place in his imagination. He travels to Cairo and Jerusalem to attend conferences in a post-Ottoman world. He's interested in the affairs of Iran and Afghanistan. I read a comment on his once about the Uyghurs in the 1930s. So he becomes like an umatic thinker. He thinks Muslims all around the world need to work together, to come together. Iqbal really disagrees, right, with this Western idea of nationalism. And he thinks that Islam in its higher form constitutes a call to kind of like a supranationalism that should supersede all other divisions. For example, he says here, "Yun to Sayyid bhi ho, Mirza bhi ho, Afghan bhi ho, tum sabhi kuch ho, batao. Tu Musalman bhi ho." You are a Sayyid, a Mirza, an Afghan, and here he's referring to kind of like different sort of tribes in the subcontinent or groups in the subcontinent. You're everything, but tell me, are you Muslim? Are you also a Muslim? Is being a Muslim first on your agenda, or is your clan or tribe or nation first on your agenda? And he does something. He takes his old poem, the one we just read, "Sara Jahan se Acha Hindustan Hamara," and he reworks it. It's on the same meter, it has the same structure, but he changes the content. And he says, "Cheen o Arab hamara, Hindustan hamara, Muslim hai hum, Watan hai Sara Jahan hamara. Dunya ke but qadon mein pehla wo ghar khuda ka, hum iske pasban hain, wo pasban hamara." China and China and Arabia are ours. India is ours. We are Muslims. The whole world is ours. The whole world is our homeland. Superior to the idol temples of the world is the house of God. We are its keepers, and it is our keeper, guardian. Let's read, this is powerful. So it's the exact same poem, the exact same meter, the same rhyme. He changes the words. And he shows obviously the reflection, the evolution in his thought. So in, I don't know, in Pakistan they recite the second one, and in India they recite the first one, I guess.
Did you recite that in Pakistan?
Yeah, it's taught. It's like a very, very, very powerful, and it's written kind of like an army marching song as well. It's a very, has a lot of oomph to it. Again, here he means like the Muslims' homeland is everywhere. Now, let's read Iqbal's poem, Nationalism, Wataniyat, and when we read it, we'll observe three major reasons why Iqbal is opposed to nationalism and why he thinks Muslims need to do better. इस दौर में मैं और है, जाम और है, जम और, साकी ने बिना की रविश लुत्फ व सितम और, मुस्लिम ने भी तामीर किया अपना हरम और, तहजीब के आज़र ने तर शराय सनम और, इन ताज़ा खुदाओं में सबसे बड़ा इन ताज़ा खुदाओं में बड़ा सबसे वतन है, जो पीरहन इसका है, वो मजहब का कफन है. In this age, the wine is different, the cup is different. The cup-bearers' conceits and airs of grace and tyranny are different. The Muslim has also constructed a new haram of his own. The Azar of civilization has made new idols of his own. Who knows who Azar is? What's the reference to Azar? It's the father of Ibrahim or the uncle of Ibrahim, whatever the different narrations say different things. But like a prominent, obviously Hazrat Ibrahim is a prominent figure in the Quran, and at the beginning of his story we have a very powerful retelling of him breaking from the sort of traditions of his forefathers and thinking for himself and deciding, following his conscience and embarking on this journey and looking at the stars and the sun and trying to understand who is God, what is God, and then of course being persecuted by it. So, Tehzeeb ki azr ne tar sharai sanam aur. Amongst these new gods, the new gods of this time, the biggest god is the country. Its clothing is the burial shroud of religion. ये बुत के तराशीदाए तहजीब नवी है, गारत गर काशानाए दीन नबवी है, बाजू तेरा तौहीद की कुवत से कवी है, इस्लाम तेरा देश है, तू मुस्तफवी है. This idol is the product of modern civilization. It is the plunderer of the structure of the Holy Prophet's religion. Yet remember that your arm is strengthened with the strength of Tawheed. You are the followers of Mustafa, the Prophet, and your country is Islam. Bilal, could you get that pani from Baba, please? Oh, it's there. Khali? That's fine. नज़ारा देरीना ज़माने को दिखा दे, ए मुस्तफ़वी खाक में इस बुत को मिला दे. हो कैद मकामी तो नतीजा है तबाही, रे बहर में आज़ाद वतन सूरत माही. Show the old ways to this new world. O follower of Mustafa, trample these idols into dust. This limitation to the local results in destruction. Live like the fish in the ocean, free from the bounds of nation. है तरके वतन सुन्नत महबूब इलाही, दे तू भी नबूवत की सदाकत पे गवाही. गुफ्तार सियासत में वतन और ही कुछ है, इरशाद नबूवत में वतन और ही कुछ है. Renouncing the country is the way of God's beloved. Won't you also testify to the prophethood's truth by doing so? In political speech, the country is something else, and in the Prophet's command, the country is something else. Aqwam jahan mein hai rakabat, to isi se. Taskhir hai maqsood tajarat, to isi se. Khali hai sadakat se siyasat, to isi se. Kamzor ka gar hota hai gharat, to isi se. The antagonism amongst the world's nations is created by this. Subjugation as the goal of commerce is created by this. Politics have become bereft of its sincerity because of this. The destruction of the homes of the weak is because of this. Aqwam mein makhluq-e khuda batti hai isse. Qawmiyat-e Islam ke jar katti hai isse. God's creation is unjustly divided among nations by this. The Islamic concept of community is uprooted by this. SubhanAllah. So when we study this poem, we find three main reasons why Iqbal is opposed to the idea of nationalism. The first is that the spirit of Islam is universal. The second is that nationalism undermines Muslim solidarity. And the third is that nationalism replaces God. Now let's go to the first one. The spirit of Islam is universal. So, when the Prophet migrated to Medina, what did he do with the tribes of Aws and Khazraj and the Muhajirin who came from Quraysh? What happened? Not you. That's not a hand? Classic, like almost a hand, but not quite. What happened? What happened in Medina, guys? Yes, he created a new community, right? He said, okay, you have your heritage and your lineage and we're all proud of it as Arabs, but we're going to do something new and something better. And he forged the divided, weak Arab tribes into literally like a new superpower. In his poem Tulu-e Islam, Iqbal says, Yahi maqsood fitrat hai, yahi ramz musalmani, akhuwat ki jahangiri, muhabbat ki farawani. Bhutan rang khoon ko tod kar, millat mein gum ho ja, na Turani rahe baki, na Irani, na Afghani. This is the destiny of nature. This is the secret of Islam. Worldwide brotherhood and the abundance of love. Break the idols of color and blood and become lost in the millet or the ummah. Let neither Turanians or Iranians or Afghans remain. Turanian is an old word for Central Asians. So Iqbal is saying that on like the higher levels of Islam, the higher objectives of Islam on a communal level can only be realized when we put aside our earthly differences. And he says that this is the highest form of community, the most enlightened form of community. But nationalism, of course, undermines this. Now, the second reason is that nationalism breaks Muslim solidarity. So there are, if we look at our Muslim Ummah, four major, like severely, structurally oppressed Muslim groups. Who can name them? Rohingya, yep. Uyghurs, Palestinians. Let's go Kashmiris. These four groups are oppressed by like outside powers. Okay? We also have a lot of internal problems, but these are the four major like oppressed groups of the Muslim Ummah. How many Muslims are there in the world?
2 billion.
2 billion. So why are the Rohingyas and the Uyghurs and the Kashmiris and the Palestinians oppressed? Like, if we just sat down and thought about it, it's an absolutely nonsensical, farcical situation, isn't it? Imagine if the Prophet was here with us today and we're like, yep, this is the Ummah in 2023 and we have these 4 major groups, and by the way, there are 2 billion of us, and we're not really doing anything about helping them. What would he say? If, for example, the OIC, which is like the Muslim kind of like UN, if it was a truly functioning body, would China have put the Uyghurs into concentration camps? Instead, we see Muslim countries cutting economic deals and shaking hands with the oppressors, with the Chinese or with the Israelis. And I'm sure very soon maybe we'll see Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman, walking around the Haram or something like that. So our trajectory is very sad, right? Nationalism, I'll give you another example. Imran Khan, who was the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, in a recent interview, and Imran Khan is one of my heroes. I have a lot of respect and admiration for him. He was asked recently, in a couple of months back, before he was put in jail unjustly, someone said, when you were Prime Minister, you again and again denied that the Uyghurs were being oppressed. You took China's side, and you just put the issue aside. And Khan, because he was out of power when he was asked, he could sort of speak a bit more freely. He said, there are like 5 million Uyghurs, and I'm in charge of a country of 250 million Muslims. How can I put their interests before these 250 million? My own people, the people of my country who have elected me. And Khan's statement on one hand is very disappointing. It's objectionable. It's sad, right? It's selling out the Uyghurs. And if you read about what's happening to the Uyghurs in the concentration camps, if you want to sleep at night, you'll have to dull your conscience. That's the only way you can rationalize it in your head. What's happening to them is unspeakable. But on the other hand, Khan's statement makes 100% sense, right? Like, we have a world system today, a nation-state system where Muslims are divided into different countries, different houses, right? And the logic of the system forces the people in the system, in the game, to look out for their own land, their own house first. It's like an inescapable logic, and you sort of can't escape it, right? And we're stuck playing a game where the rules have been rigged. And this isn't actually just a problem for Islam, by the way. What are the 2 kind of like biggest, or like what's like kind of like the biggest global problem right now? Like one of the biggest issues, you hear about it all the time in the media.
Ukraine, Russia.
Climate change, right? Global issue, climate change, right? Climate change is like, if we don't do something about the changing climate, we're all going down. But we're not doing much about climate change, right? We live in a capitalist system where money talks, and we live in a nation-state system where it's like, wait a minute, why should I reduce my emissions? If I reduce my emissions, then my economic productivity will go down, and that nation will go ahead of me. So the system itself, the logic of the system, undermines collective action. So it's not just, again, a problem even with Islam, us as Muslims, it's a human problem. The nation-state system is stopping us from coming up with genuine collective solutions to the problems that affect us all. One of the ways that in the West they've tried to overcome the embedded division of the nation-state system is come up with global institutions like the UN, for example, or in Iqbal's time, the League of Nations. But Iqbal is actually very skeptical of this global multilateralism. And he tells Muslims that they can't rely on them. In his poem here, An Eastern League of Nations, he says, Tehran ho gar alam mashriq ka Geneva, shayad kurra-e arz ki takdeer badal jaye. Were Tehran to become the Geneva of the East, perhaps the destiny of the world would change. In another poem, Filistini Arab se, to the Palestinian Arab, he says, Teri dawa na Geneva mein hai, na London mein, farang ki rage jaan panjai Yahud mein hai. Suna hai maine, gulami se ummaton ki nijat, khudi ki parvarish wa lizzat-e namud mein hai. Your cure is neither in Geneva or in London, or nowadays we can say in New York, where the UN is based. The throats of Europe are in the grips of the Jews. So he means the Zionists, right, who convinced Great Britain to give Palestine to them. I've heard, though, that nations gain freedom from slavery from building their khudi. So he says that if Muslims are going to get anywhere, they can't rely on like Western human rights regimes and the UN and all these different organizations. Ultimately, those groups, those things are beholden to the very hypocritical and materialistic interests of the West, right? The same West talks a lot about democracy and is the biggest supporter of Israel. We know this script. I don't have to go talk at length into it. He says that we need to like stand up on our own 2 feet. Now, the third reason that I mentioned why Iqbal opposes Western nationalism is that it erects a new idol in the place of God. And this is a very, very like deep philosophical critique. Basically, thinkers have been saying for a while, for example, Carl Schmitt says that, the famous political theorist says that the nation progressively appropriates all the functions of God and installs them into the nation state. And what happens is people's entire sense of morality, like what is right and wrong, becomes based on what flag they pledge allegiance to or what silly piece of land they had the coincidence to be born into, right? I was talking to someone once and we're talking about Pakistan. I said, the Pakistan army, it kidnaps people and makes people disappear and tortures people and kills people. Isn't that awful? And he said, no, but they're enemies of the nation. I said, no, but they're Muslims too, right? Like they haven't even committed a crime. There's no trial, nothing. They're just disappeared like this. I said, no, they're enemies to the nation. They deserve what's happening to them. So this person's entire sense of morality, he's a Muslim, the people in the army are Muslim, the people being killed are Muslim or being disappeared are Muslim, but everyone's sense of what's right and wrong isn't about the Haqq or the Quran or what the Prophet said. It's about what is in the national interest. This is how nationalism replaces our sense of morality. And then you have people who will fight and die and kill for a piece of flag, a piece of earth. Iqbal's very, very deep critique above is इन ताज़ा खुदाओं में बड़ा सबसे वतन है जो पीरहन इसका है वो मजहब का कफन है. Amongst these new gods, the biggest is the country. Its clothing is the burial shroud of religion. That's what he's talking about here. And you can see this way back in the early 20th century, right? You have, for example, in Europe, Iqbal sees World War I, you have Christians in France killing Christians in Germany, but they're both Christians. What would Hazrat Isa say? What would the Pope say? Whatever, right? Like, what an absurd situation. How could you, the faith you have in an infinite afterlife, the shared bond you have in an infinite afterlife, by logic and by common sense and morality and scripture, is always more important than the accidental place that you were born or the temporary bonds that you may share with people around you, right? Dunya is finite, akhirat is infinite. So therefore we should organize all our affairs to the akhirah, right? Our moral affairs, but also our political affairs. It seems like really, really obvious to me. I don't know about you guys, but we live in a system that institutionally suppresses this sense, distracts us from it. Now, Iqbal wants to see a united ummah. Is this possible? This seems so idealistic and so, air in the clouds. Is this possible? I want to offer a way of thinking, right? Sometimes we think that the time we live in is the most important time, and sometimes we can lack a sense of perspective. When we learn history and when we study history, we start to see patterns, right? If we take the long view of Muslim history, we might see things differently. So we're in the 14th century of the Ummah. The Muslim Ummah has been going on for 14 centuries, 1435 years maybe? I think so? 44, okay, off by 11 years. So the situation we see today in the Muslim world has actually really only been going on for 100 years. When did troubles for the Palestinians start?
The troubles, or when did they?
Like when did things really become when did things go really bad for the Palestinians basically? Around 1950. When did Kashmiris become subject to sort of like a hostile external power? When did their troubles sort of really start in a sense? 1950s. 1950, 1947. Who knows their Uyghur history? When did troubles for the Uyghurs really start? When? 1950s. 1950. That's when China annexes an independent Uyghur republic. When do troubles for the Rohingya start? Also 1950. All of these four oppressed Muslim nations, their problems start in the late 1940s, 1950. Yeah, less than 100 years, and all at the same time, by the way. And now it's been 75 years since then. So when we start seeing history as sort of like cycles or phases, we realize that the things we think are solid and permanent and stable aren't actually so stable. Baba, what were you doing in 1989? Do you remember?
Yeah.
How was 89? Good year?
Yeah.
Lots of fun in 89, I think?
89, yeah.
You were a student, right?
I was a student.
Yeah. Did Baba?
I was actually Afghanistan war and all that.
Yeah. Amazing time. Baba, did you ever think that in 1989, in 1990, that the Soviet Union would collapse?
1991.
Right? It was sort of like a 3-year process. It finishes in 91. Aapne kabhi socha? All of our parents who were alive, right, in 1989, not one of them could ever have foreseen that the Soviet Union would collapse and the map of the world would shift just like this. And if we go back to the generation before, could any of our grandparents have thought, for example, that World War II would go the way it would go? And if we go back a generation before, could any of our ancestors have, had they looked at a map of the world in 1900 and a map of the world in 1920, radically different, right? So change is always happening, whether we see it or not. The question is, what's our role in it? Iqbal writes, ये कायनात अभी ना तमाम है शायद कि आ रही है दमादम सदाए कुन फयकुन. The universe is perhaps still unfinished, still in motion, for I hear the ongoing sounds of the command kun fayakun. So things are always changing, things are always in motion. And that should tell us that, yeah, things can change again, right? Why not? Anyone who tells you otherwise lacks imagination and a good understanding of history. So Iqbal is an idealist and he's a realist. We've discussed his idealism in the poems above. Dr. Avamar Anjum describes Iqbal as having a radical hope. What's amazing is that as Iqbal's life progresses and draws to a close, things are going the other way. Nationalism in the Muslim world is rising, Ottoman Empire collapses, the Caliphate is abolished, Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, Reza Shah in Iran. You have secular liberal elites all across the Muslim world taking power. Communism becomes a huge force. A lot of Iqbal's latter poetry talks about communism. He has this poem, Iqbal expresses his disappointment. He says in a poem titled Mashriq, the East, Na Mustafa na Reza Shah mein namood uski, ke ruh sharq badan ki talash mein hai abhi. Ill-lodged in Ataturk or Reza Shah, the soul of the East is still in search of a figure to represent it. But Iqbal pushes, he pushes, and it pays off. His ideas take shape in the Pakistan movement. His ideas are influential in the lead up to the Iranian Revolution. And his ideas are in this room in Underwood, Brisbane, right? So Iqbal, again, he's also a realist. So he has this quote from his epic prose work Reconstruction, written in like 1930. And he sees that the pendulum has like swung the other way. All these nations have emerged. We can't really like think about uniting the Ummah right now. So he says that the trend of modern Islam for the present is that every Muslim country must sink into her own deeper self, temporarily focus her vision on herself alone, until all are strong and powerful to form a living family of republics. It seems to me that God is slowly bringing home to us the truth that Islam is neither nationalism nor imperialism, but a league of nations which recognizes artificial boundaries and racial distinctions for facility of reference only, not for restricting the social horizons of its members. So he thinks that, okay, these nations have arisen, we need to build these nations up, and then we can think again about reuniting the Ummah. It's been 100 years since Iqbal wrote this, and I think hopefully we're ready to move on to the next stage. The nations are here, they've been around for a long time. We need to also think about more collective action, right? I think what we need to do as Muslims, if we think about the sort of next 30, 40 years of the Muslim Ummah, is that we all need to ensure that we have fair, just, representative governments in our countries. So not dictators, not oligarchies, not monarchies, right? We should make dua that the right parties and the right leaders come to power. And we should support them where we can if we make the assessment that these are good, genuine, honest people. We shouldn't look to the solution in authoritarian regimes or dictators because they're always self-interested and bend Islam to their purposes. And the idea behind this is that a fair, democratic, equitable Muslim society, which has an elite class that thinks ummatically, will automatically look towards the interests of the Ummah. So, for example, Turkey in the last 20 years, Malaysia in the last 20 years, you've had economic growth, and you've had governments that have come to power that represent the people's will, like they've come to power democratically in a fair way, and they're Islamically minded. And so this means that the natural Muslim sentiments of the population is able to come out. And it's Malaysia and Turkey that have really been kind of like at the forefront of ummatic thinking and thought. But wherever you have dictatorships, like in Egypt, or monarchies like in Saudi Arabia, you haven't really seen that ummatic thinking come out, right? Yemen is for several years has been under a state of war and siege and lots of famine and suffering, right? It doesn't take that much money, for example, to pour into the country to fix this problem. But who can tell me how much the Saudi government paid for Cristiano Ronaldo to come and play in the Saudi Soccer League?
100 million?
An obscene amount of money, right? All of these stupid, silly little soccer stars coming from Europe, and they're being paid hundreds of millions of dollars to kick a ball around on a field. That's how the Ummah's money is being spent, right? So whoa, isn't that absurd?
Yeah, I have a question.
Ji.
You said dictatorship like Saudi. Are you saying that generally the Muslim Ummah under a democracy can level up to the point where you get to this ummatic thinking, or wouldn't it be Turkey has a lot of internal struggles, you know? So literally flip of the switch, one bad election and it could have went totally the opposite way, right? So are you saying that because you describe Saudi as a dictatorship,
As a monarchy, actually, but it's both. Yeah.
But a dictatorship could also be used in the opposite way. If you have a leader, for example, let's say, Supreme Leader Imran Khan, if he got into power, he generally had the Islamic mindset, that philosophy, where he could have you don't know how much he could do, but he could have led to some good things.
So that's kind of like a really attractive idea, right? Like a strong man in the right place and he'll make things work. But the thing with dictatorships, as history tells us, is that dictators are always self-interested, and they always, ultimately, it's about them keeping power, because power is iqtidarik lalach hai. Power is a lust, and once you have it, you don't want to let go of it. When you're a dictator, that's what bigger ego trip is that, right? So these dictators always use Islam for their purposes, but history tells us time and time again, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Gaddafi, Saddam, like, unfortunately, Muslims have really bad political literacy, and some of us think that, yes, dictators are the way to go, but that it never pans out that way, because they always subvert Islam for their own agendas. So Dr. Avamar Anjum says that, like Muslims, we all have this in our heart. We know this is like the haqq and that we all belong to one community. But our institutions and our regimes deny the full realization of this ummatic sentiment. So, this is Iqbal's message. Islam above all else, in our community, in our friendships, in our dealings, and in our sort of like political vision of how the world should be. So I have some action points for you all, because obviously this is a more of a idealistic or theoretical topic, but let's make some action points. One is have a more mature political outlook, inshallah. Just like sit down and think about the way the Muslim world is structured and ask yourself, does this really make sense? Who would design a system like this? How absurd. Surely we can do better, right? Don't support dictators. Don't support simplistic slogans. Connect with the Ummatics Institute. If you're really interested in the future of the Muslim world on this big level, there's a wonderful institute that's been founded last year called Ummatics Institute. And there's a bunch of really serious, really mature Muslim academics who are leading the charge and are articulating kind of like a new imagination for the Muslim world going forward. Keep the Ummah, of course, in your du'as, the oppressed nations of our Ummah. And I also have some advice to everyone listening. Connect to Islam's civilizational heritage. What Muslims need today is a civilizational revival. The way to do that is, or the key to this civilizational revival, is learn language. Almost all of you will have some sort of ancestral language, some heritage language, right? Learn it. If you're from the subcontinent, learn Urdu or learn Persian or learn whatever. If you're Turkish, learn Ottoman Turkish. If you're from Indonesia or Malaysia, go and learn Jawi. If white people can like go and waste their time learning Japanese and Korean, right? Why can't we reconnect to our native? No,
He's a white boy.
Your circumstances are different. No, he grew up in Japan, so it's fine. Yeah, it's fine. He's a istisna, special case. Yeah. Why can't we also turn our energies and tap into the civilizational treasure and heritage that we have, right? 3 years ago, I couldn't even read Urdu. I couldn't even read Iqbal. And now somehow, I'm like talking about him and giving lectures on the topic, right? After reading all his poetry. So, if you have an ancestral language, a heritage language, learn it. If you don't have one, pick one. Farsi, Arabic, whatever. When you do, you will find so many more Iqbals. And maybe you'll become the Iqbal that this ummah needs.
Allah.
I want to recite. I want to recite two more poems here on the last page. Iqbal says, "Gay din ke tanha tha, main anjuman mein, yahan ab mere razdan aur bhi hain." Gone are the days when I was alone amidst the assembly. For here, now, my confidants await. The razdan, the confidants are all of you. Iqbal ka tarana bangdara hai goya, hota hai jada pema, phir karwan hamara. Iqbal's song is like the bell of a caravan. With this then, once more, our caravan departs for its destination. I'm so thankful. I will finish up now. I'm so thankful to Sheikh Suhair for this platform. I'm thankful to Jawahid for facilitating the lectures and making the posters. Thank you all for attending, especially those who have been here from the first or second sessions. May Allah Ta'ala bless, the grave of Allama Iqbal. May Allah Ta'ala raise his station in the afterlife. May He forgive his shortcomings, and may Allah Ta'ala allow all of us to benefit from the effort and fikr and parishani and worry and care that Allama Iqbal had for the Muslim Ummah that reaches us 100 years later. So may Allah elevate his station, and may Allah help all the oppressed nations of our Ummah and enable us to rise above our present situation. ربنا زدنا علما حكمة إيمانا إحسانا ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. آمين ثم آمين. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Just want to say a big Jazakallah khairan.